Hello, I'm Crispin Blunt. I'm the MP for Reigate in England in the United Kingdom. I'm a member of the House of Commons, a Conservative MP, and also chair of a campaign group called the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group Limited. And I'm looking forward to being interviewed on Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night?
Hello, listener, and welcome back to the Professionally Cannabis Podcast. Today, we have a very special episode. Oscar, would you be able to tell our listener who we have today?
Yes. So we've got the Right Honourable Crispin Blunt, MP for Reigate, representing the Conservative Party. This is really interesting. I mean, already with Sir Norman Lamb, it was tremendous to have a perspective from Westminster. But what makes having Crispin Blunt on just that little bit more spicy is that he's a member of the Conservative Party, the biggest party in Parliament at the moment in the UK, the one who holds power, and probably the closest thing we're going to get to having a open conversation with the establishment. Well, I say close to the establishment, but as lockdown continues, this episode was recorded remotely. In actual fact, in a similar fashion to our interview with Sir Norman Lamb, although that one was remote because there was a prorogation of Parliament in order to try and squeeze Brexit through. Maybe next year we'll be able to get in the same room as a parliamentarian, but from our current standing, I don't see it happening.
Absolutely. I think third time's a charm. Boris, we'll meet you in number 10 in a few months' time.
Listeners, enjoy this episode. I know we did.
Where do they go, the smoke rings
It gives me
I
great
blow
pleasure to
each
welcome to the pod Crispin Blunt, MP for Reigate within the UK Parliament. Having served his constituency since 1997, Crispin has campaigned tirelessly on an array of political issues, most pertinent to our audience around the legislation and legalisation of cannabis, as well as other drugs. With all this in mind, there's only one thing left to say. Crispin, welcome to the Professionally Cannabis Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Crispin, it's an honour to have you on our show, and I'd love to hear from your seat as an MP, what led you to the plant?
An interest in drugs policy generally, which came from my time as Minister for Prisons between 2010 and 2012, when I saw the awful cost to our criminal justice system and to society generally of dealing with drug use through the criminal justice system and not through the public health system. And when I found myself no longer chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee because I lost the election to reclaim that in 2017, I decided that this would be one of the issues I would focus on. And I became the first Conservative to become the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group for drug policy reform in general. And that group was very focused on the area where they saw progress could be achieved in the United Kingdom, which was on the legalization of medicine from cannabis. And I was content to endorse that direction and that focus. And we started our work in the new 2017 Parliament in the autumn. And then I'm pleased to say that by the spring of 2018, we had got formally medicine from cannabis, at least legally and in the political sense, over the line with the change of policy following the campaigns by both the Dingley and the Caldwell families in the UK, the families of two epileptic boys who were material to creating the conditions to force, in effect, the government's hand to change its policy.
When we talk about the government changing its hand, for a lot of families and patients on the ground, there's been very little real progress. It seems that perhaps there's been parliamentary action, but patient access still tops the anxiety list for those suffering and who believe that they could derive some benefit from cannabis-derived medicines. Do you think that there's more going into this, more momentum with this change coming from these reform groups?
There's certainly more work going on, and indeed my own journey on this issue was having become the first Conservative to co-chair the all-party parliamentary group for drug policy reform. I and the other new co-chair, who's a mainstream Labour MP called Jeff Smith, we succeeded a very left-wing Labour MP, lovely guy called Paul Flynn, long time sort of hero of the cannabis movement, but really associated with protests and throwing rocks at the establishment from the outside, and the leader of the Green Party, Caroline Lucas. Neither of them could be seen to be mainstream figures. And indeed, the other officers of this group are principally drawn from politicians of the left. And when I proposed to the group that actually what we really needed to do is raise our game, and on the back of what was happening in North America with the tidal wave of investor money now coming into this industry, what we needed to do was to get a proper public affairs capability, a proper research capability, a proper public relations capability to support our efforts to campaign for change. They looked at me with horror that they couldn't possibly have filthy commercial money coming into this business to support their pure parliamentary campaigning. Because I ran into a brick wall there in terms of increasing the capacity to campaign in the UK and recognizing that the principal barrier to progress in the United Kingdom in the end is obviously the politicians and the officials of the establishment, I decided to form the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group Limited as a company for it to be able to take resources from investors outside the United Kingdom who saw the opportunity of the development of the UK market, but to so structure it that it is completely transparent and open, that whilst it says Conservative on the tin, that describes the object of its attentions. It is not about getting the Conservative Party elected. It is not in any way wanting to be an electoral force in the UK. What it's wanting to do is to change the policy of the centre-right and the Conservative Party in particular. That led to a requirement, obviously, of proper transparency. It means that as far as professional cannabis is concerned, I am the only person who definitively cannot be professional about this because it is absolutely essential that I do not earn any money from my campaigning in this area. Otherwise, that would prevent me from speaking about this in Parliament. So I am the one in this area who has to remain a definitive amateur. But what Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group Limited does is provide me and then other like-minded Conservatives who are minded to join us is with the research and the campaigning capacity to bring these arguments home. And you're just touching on the issue of the development of medicine from cannabis in the United Kingdom. And the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group has just published the first part of our review of the British position on medical cannabis. It's called the UK Review of Medicinal Cannabis, The Needs of a Nation. Its authors are Dave King and Amber Moore, who are the real research brains, analytical brains at the heart of CDPRG. And they put together an academically reviewed paper which identifies essentially how the UK has got on after the first 18 months or so of actually having a regulatory and license regime established for medicinal cannabis in the UK. And it is, of course, exactly as you said it was at the beginning of this question. The fact is very few people can access this as they would access other medicines on the National Health Service in the UK. You either need money, quite a lot of it, getting on for about way over $10,000 a year, to consult a private doctor and to get a private prescription and to pay the very substantial import and management fees that remain associated with the handling of legal cannabis, legal licensed and regulated cannabis in the UK. Or you continue to have to get your supply either from your criminal dealer, or you become a criminal yourself or continue to be a criminal yourself and you grow the stuff for yourself. And there are reported to be about 100,000 Britons who are growing their own cannabis to address the symptoms of whatever medical condition they have.
And so, Crispin, for the non-amateurs out there, those business people, investors, whoever it may be, who are probably in North America, but maybe on mainland Europe, and are wanting to understand how they engage and interact with the UK cannabis scene, how do you as an amateur facilitate that?
Well, I'm the amateur, hopefully at the head of a professional organisation designed to give me and other Conservative parliamentarians the expertise, the research and capability to campaign and promote what is, I believe, a very clear public interest case of changing the law in the United Kingdom to have sensible drug policy laws not based on prejudice and outdated attitudes. And I need the resources to be able to do that. And so if people are looking to effect a change in the United Kingdom, and that change has got to come at the parliamentary level in the change of our law and our regulations, then I hope they will look at the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group as a company in which they can invest to help achieve our shared objectives.
For those MPs and policy influencers that are still, say, on the fence regarding wider rollout of cannabis medicines, and with an armoury of data from randomised controlled trials probably still some while away, what do you think can be done to win these folks around? Like, what arguments do you think would resonate with your Conservative colleagues, for example? Would it be around the economics of it, health, crime and justice, environment? What do you think would really pique their interest further than it may have already done?
We're focusing our efforts is to point to the fact that the regulatory changes that were made in the first instance of legalization simply haven't delivered a sensible access to a legal product where there is clearly a need, and that the vast majority of people are still, in effect, having to access it criminally. That is a problem for the Home Office, because if you are asking the prosecution service and the police to pursue people who are growing cannabis to address their MS symptoms, that's quite a difficult place to be. And the accounts of MS sufferers who've been growing their cannabis, having the police crying as they take this person's medicine away, speaks eloquently to the, frankly, long-term inability to be able to sustain that as a criminal justice policy. So last year, CDPRG crowdfunded the defence of a lady called Leslie Gibson and her husband, who were arrested at the beginning of 2019 for growing cannabis, which they used to address her MS. And a year later, the Crown Prosecution Service finally gave up on the prosecution after we had recruited decent quality lawyers to present their defence. We are now in active conversation with the CPS and the Director of Public Prosecutions and Home Office ministers about how we can get them out of the bind that they are in. And one of the ways of getting them out of the bind that they are in, I intend, will be presented as a practical proposition in Part B of our paper, which will then, having in Part A outlined the current situation in the UK, Part B will outline the regulatory options to deliver us from many of the problems that we are in. Part C, I hope the government will publish, which will be its solution that it has chosen to all of this. If it doesn't, we'll publish Part C and tell it of these options, ones that we think would be the best. But obviously, I hope that the conversation with both ministers and officials in the Home Office and ministers and officials in the Department of Health cajole, encourage, persuade them that the political and practical problems that the current system now continues to present can be solved by a regulatory framework that can regulate medicine from cannabis much more intelligently in the United Kingdom.
And something I want to ask about that ability to persuade, because, of course, on this podcast, we talk to many people who are pushing for reform with regards to cannabis, but not many of them are members of parliament of a party that is currently in government with an overwhelming majority. So really, you're probably in one of the most prime positions to understand the government's thinking here. You're talking with colleagues about making changes in their day-to-day. What is the feeling towards cannabis in Westminster within your party?
Well, of course, most of my colleagues think we've done it. That this happened when Billy Caldwell got his special licence from Sajid Javid when he was Home Secretary to have his medicine returned after it was confiscated by customs when he came back from Canada with his medicine to deliver his epilepsy on a Monday. By Thursday, he was in hospital fitting. By Friday, his overseeing consultant was on the steps of the hospital saying, well, I don't care about the wider situation. It's just unbelievably cruel to take medicine away from a child. And on Saturday, he got his medicine back. 6 months later, they had produced the system by which medicine from cannabis was going to be prescribed in the United Kingdom. The trouble is, it's just not working in any real way. And that's what's now got to be addressed. But most of my colleagues think, well, we've done it. Well, we haven't done it. They need to continue to be brought to attention that most of their constituents who want medicine from cannabis to address the conditions for which it is already assessed as being of merit, can't get it unless they decide to go the criminal route. There are informed officials and ministers who are in charge, who need to be persuaded that this is a priority issue they need to focus on. And that's where the conversation is at the moment to move things forward.
And because I think you say, oh, yes, we've done it. But from following your work over the years, I think you probably wouldn't be satisfied with a medical-only reformation. You're looking for a regulated market that prevents children getting hands on drugs and criminals getting their hands on the lucre from it. So what do you say about those conversations? Or do you not even bring them up until medical solves?
Well, it's important that they're different issues. They should not be dealt with together. Part of the arguments I will make, and I'm making to Home Office ministers, is that their stated position on recreational cannabis, which is the government is not contemplating any change in its policy on recreational cannabis, that the failure of the current ability for people to get proper access to medicinal cannabis undermines respect for the law and creates a very significant criminal demand. And until they sort the medicine out, that's going to continue to undermine the government's policy on recreational cannabis. Why I think one should and can run these arguments separately is that the Canadians, the Uruguayans, 12 American states, the District of Columbia, possibly to be joined by Luxembourg and New Zealand, are about to pour evidence out at us about how you might have a licensed and regulated recreational cannabis market, about whether the promises with which the Canadians were convinced to vote for Mr. Trudeau and for Mr. Trudeau to introduce the regulated licensed cannabis market in Canada to protect children and to reduce criminality, whether that's going to happen as the markets are developed. There are obviously an awful lot of work to be done in examination of exactly what regulations and what license conditions that are applied in the different jurisdictions and the lessons we learn from that. The early emerging ones are that in Colorado, the politicians got quite greedy and they leveled too high a tax rate on the legal cannabis. So the result is that the illegal supply chain is still in business. So that's one of the lessons. So how do you tax this? How do you regulate it? All of these, plenty of lessons in all the complexities of this to be learnt by all these jurisdictions who are tackling this issue separately.
Do you expect the economic fallout from COVID, which we, of course, will see, to have any impact upon the pace at which the UK and indeed other countries around the world accelerate their cannabis programs?
It's too early to say. We're still locked down and only just beginning to emerge from it. So what is certainly true is there is a vast amount of government attention plainly focused on COVID, and anyone has to look at the newspapers to see how difficult it is to any other issue to battle its way to public attention.
But focusing on the jobs aspect of that, and maybe let's take COVID's acceleration out of the picture. We've talked about reform coming from a justice and or health perspective, but one would assume that the economic implications, the jobs, industry, innovation, eventual IP creation, and novel medicines, novel cannabinoids that could all spring forth from this, are those factors weighing in on ministers' minds when they think about this issue?
Not as much as they should do, but I see that part of my responsibility to keep banging the drum for it and to make clear that every day we delay in having a proper regulated system that actually gives people access to these medicines and also supports the science and the research into the very substantial potential benefits that are still yet to be properly medically and scientifically established. But obviously the thing that's very exciting about this whole business is that we'll look as if we're only kind of scraping at the surface yet of how a proper application of cannabis-derived medicines can significantly improve many, many people's quality of life. And instead of people dealing with the discomforts of old age by use of alcohol, they would be infinitely better off with a sensible application of the right type of cannabis. Now, we have an awful long way to go before we get to the place where cannabis cookies and what have you are then of the right sort, are then playing their role in making people much more comfortable in dealing with all those diseases of old age.
Now, we touched upon a few of the other jurisdictions around the world who have and are rolling out their cannabis programs. From your experiences of the Canadian regimes when you went out there and other regulatory programs that you have seen, what are the winning components that you've seen from other countries that you believe that the UK might be able to use and replicate here? And what have you seen that hasn't worked so well that you think that we would have to do differently in the UK?
Well, on medicine, it strikes me that those countries that have given themselves a cannabis authority, in other words, have concentrated the place from where the regulations are going to come, are better placed than those where its responsibility is sitting in different places with unable to reconcile all the competing different interests. And classically in the UK, obviously, the Home Office and Health Department divide is kind of excruciatingly painful to watch. But I think that there is certainly an enthusiasm, I think, in the Home Office now at the political level to get the health part of this business off their hands and put it properly under the auspices of the Department of Health. Of course, with that goes a whole bunch of regulations and license controls and all the rest, all of which are acting against the wider interests of the public. And it's not just cannabis, it applies to other drugs as well. For example, there's one of the other papers the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group has produced recently is on the case to reschedule psilocybin as a drug from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. And that is simply to enable medical research to happen to it more easily. If a drug is publicly declared as an offender of the first order that will never be of any use to anybody, it does rather reduce the market for businesses and other potential investors in medical research to invest in it. Well, drugs like psilocybin, LSD, and MDMA are now showing really quite exciting potential with respect to the treatment of trauma and depression, and those two conditions alone affect millions of people. In the case of PTSD, there are 7,500 veterans who are with a hot button political issue, British veterans who've come back from the recent military service in Iraq and Afghanistan with trauma from their service. And a third of those have trauma so seriously that it's beyond treatment by the current therapies available to them. And there's very promising signs that some of these drugs have the ability to, in effect, enable some kind of medical reset of the brain and enable the underlying trauma that can otherwise take an infinitely long time to be talked out and dealt with through cognitive behavior therapy, that with proper support there looks as though there's a real opportunity for us to deal with trauma that is so far where we can't find help for these veterans. And when these people are committing suicide as a consequence of the experience they've gone through, alarmingly high rates, then we owe them a duty for their service. And if regulations are stopping the research being done for no particular purpose, then there's a rather big question to be asked. That is another area of our work where it is about drug policy reform on the evidence. And that's what I'm after. I'm not asking people to do anything because of a belief in things. If we're going to make a change, we need to evidence it and to evidence the benefits of making that change. Now, as far as drug policy reform, as far as recreational cannabis is concerned, the massive plus of taking this business out of the hands of criminals and making the supply of very strong cannabis to children very much more difficult, because you've then got a regulated, controlled industry, and you lose your business if you decide to sell to children, and you would certainly lose your business if you are selling products that are of a strength that present a danger to them. I think would be a much better place to protect children if we had a legal, regulated and licensed market. Here in the UK, people will associate psychosis in the young with cannabis. Now, because the market is different in the United States, you tend not to have those conversations, or you have ask those questions to people and they look at you rather blankly because it's not a regular experience. Well, the nature of the criminal supply chain in the UK means that it is. And I think we, on that basis alone, we've got a duty to get on and protect our children from what's being punted to them on the streets and enable us to bear down on that supply chain, because it's not worth it, because most adults will be able to legally get their cannabis in a regulated way as they can in much of North America now, but they know what they're getting, and children can't get it.
Well, the first issue I want to raise is around the classical psychedelics and cannabis, which were both scheduled around the same time in the 60s and the 70s. And my question comes to you as a politician of the centre-right. So there's long been an equivocation or some sort of cause and effect drawn between hallucinogenic or cannabis drug use and left-wing political views. I think Reagan's probably the most renowned one of this, saying that cannabis was just for use by lefties and we need to wipe it out to stop communism, etc. But I wonder, do you feel that there is any of that political holdover when it comes to regulating these drugs that have been with us for over half a century now and very early on were shown to have decent therapeutic potential?
We're 50 years behind, over half a century behind where we ought to be in terms of the medical research into the potential benefits of this product. And the rather horrifying answer is that it's because the basis of the policy that emerged, that the world agreed to, largely at the behest of the United States in 1961, was straightforward product of racist American policing and racist American attitudes of the 1950s. Black Americans were significant users of cannabis. Ergo, it can't be of any merit whatsoever. And that is the intellectual and moral basis of the policy. And it's utterly and completely appalling. Today, it is now accepted across the piece. And the parties of the centre-right over the last, or if you like, the parties of the establishment in the liberal West have come to understand that these equality issues attach to the characteristics of people that are innate, are absolutely deserving and require the utmost respect and proper delivery of equality. And that goes around race and sexuality and disability and all the other innate characteristics. And if one looks at those issues, now the parties of the establishment have, if you like, caught up on those issues. There is absolutely no reason why these issues should not be dealt with on their merits. And actually the immorality of the basis of our drugs policy and the immorality of why certain drugs find themselves in particular schedules and the fact that it's not been done on any basis of fact whatsoever, I think is a rather useful basis on which to address the current state of our drug policy. The foundation of it is deeply, deeply unsound.
And that leads very nicely into part 2, which is how we address it. My question here is, part of your campaigning for cannabis has involved going to states where it's legal, consuming it, understanding how the market works, and even being videoed doing so, I believe. Would you do the same for psilocybin or LSD, or one of the more extreme changes of consciousness causing new drugs that are coming into vogue in therapeutic use?
Would make for a great video.
Well, the answer to that question is yes, but the challenge of being a lawmaker is you've got to abide by the law. So one has to find a jurisdiction where it's legal. And
not
importantly,
just decriminalised in Denver then.
And important to be properly supported and know what you're doing. And I'm told, and there have been newspaper articles in the UK and magazine articles about people who've gone off to do the psilocybin program, where I think people go for 3 days to Holland, where there's a day of kind of briefing before the experience and a day of the experience and a day of recovery. And it's a supported program and helping people understand what they're doing and giving them the education around the product at the same time. And that sounds to me a pretty responsible way of introducing people to whatever effect it is that this stuff does. And I haven't done it, so I don't know what it does. But certainly there are others, as far as cannabis is concerned, who are going to be infinitely more expert than I. So I wouldn't look to me as an informed user. Frankly, what my view is about the individual merits of particular drugs is neither here nor there. What's got to be proceeded on is a proper evidential basis about what the demand is for these drugs and the experiences associated with them, what's the best way of managing that demand in the interest of wider public health. And if you can't manage the demand away in that sense, and you've then got a decision to make about whether you are going to have a criminal free market or just put the stuff on the shelf at Tesco and have a legal free market, both of those options, experience would suggest, are a thoroughly bad way of trying to control and manage it. And a better way is the middle way of having the product to be formally legal, but you then put around it the protections that people can get through a licensed and properly regulated market with age controls, content controls, etc., proper public education, and indeed a certain amount of tax revenue to help pay for all that and to pay for the, like alcohol, Alcohol is just another drug. It happens to be legal. 90% of people enjoy their alcohol without getting too many problems associated with it. Sadly, like many other drugs, 10% of people get in a thorough mess with it. And we need a public health system that is equipped to help people avoid the mess, and if they get into a mess, get them out of it.
And perhaps to move on to something slightly more lighthearted, and actually something that we covered with Sir Norman Lamb when he was on the podcast. Now, how far away do you believe we are from, say, a cohort of future leadership candidates? Now this could be for any party, not having to mention cannabis when they're running through their disclosures about previous dalliances with naughty salts and other things of the sort?
Well, the answer is I don't know. But we are until we, in that sense, legalise and get to a place where the state has taken control of this business and protect people properly, rather than simply watch a highly efficient criminal supply chain meet public demand, which is frankly what the situation is now in much of the UK, and enforcement attention is focused on the supply chain, and the police are faced with the rotten dilemma as the moment they disrupt a market, as the supply of a market in one place, they in effect create a vacuum, which is then fought over by alternative criminal suppliers into that space, and criminals fight with violence, not through the law courts. And if we don't move from that, then the answer to your question is we're going to stay where we were with the last Conservative leadership election, which was everybody had something they didn't want to say about their use of drugs. And it's rather like I went to speak at Durham University, their freshers debate, a couple of years ago with the then Chief Constable, the wonderful Mike Barton, who has led much of the development of operational police thinking around drug law enforcement in the UK, who asked his audience, about 300 first-year students, how many of them had done an illegal drug. And 80% of that audience put a hand up and confessed to a crime in front of the Chief Constable. Are we then surprised that the parade of candidates to the Conservative leadership were all having to manage the same issue? Who was going to crawl out of the woodwork and say, I saw you doing X, Y, or Z?
May I just say, Crispin, it's been an absolute honour to have you on. I'm sure Johnny agrees. And thank you for being our guest.
Where do they go? The smoke rings I blow each night.
Well, listeners, we hope you enjoyed our second episode of Politically Cannabis. And if you did so and you want to see more of it, like, subscribe, comment, or otherwise get in touch, and we'll be sure to bring more of that content your way. Johnny, what did you think about getting political?
Look, I really enjoy these episodes, and I hope for our international audience it gives a bit of a flavour as to the political temperature that's being taken in Europe, and we will certainly be bringing our global audience more of these types of interviews, and indeed more from the science world and of course the business world. But until next time, it's been great having you with us, and have a great rest of the day.
Hello, please take me above, take me with you.